I had a 2-year relationship with a man whose real name was John Dines. I knew him as John Barker. Some of you may have heard this before. Luckily for you, I'm going to give a shortened version because you've heard from Alison and from all the others, so I need to condense it. It's a bit long. I was involved with a group called London Greenpeace in the 1980s, late 1980s, and after about 3 years of going to that group and being friends with this guy who I knew as John Barker, we started a relationship, and then we moved into a flat together, and we talked about spending the rest of our lives together and having a family. I loved him deeply. He said that he loved me. And then after about 18 months of the relationship, he seemed to be going through some sort of mental breakdown, and then he disappeared. And the last I heard from him was a couple of letters which were postmarked from South Africa saying that he'd gone to try and sort his head out, and that if he managed to sort it out, he'd kind of come back, and we could get back together. Obviously, when he disappeared, I was extremely worried about his well-being because he'd seemed to be going through some sort of a breakdown, and I was also extremely upset about having lost this person that I'd loved so much and had wanted to spend my future with. And so I then embarked on a massive search to try and track him down using the clues that I had, what things that I thought were real about him, like for example, while we'd been in a relationship, he told me about his mother and his father dying, and I went to try and find out, their death certificates in the hope that that might give me a clue as to where he was from, and maybe the solicitors, and I could find him that way, in terms of the will. But everything that I investigated actually just turned up. It was basically like meeting a wall. Everything turned out to be false. And so I became increasingly concerned about who he'd really been. And then one day, while I was fighting the McLibel trial in the 1990s, on the way home from court, I was passing the registry of births, deaths and marriages, and just really on a kind of instinctive feeling, I decided to go in and look through the death records. And when I did that, I found out that the name that my partner had been using was actually the name of a child who died when they were 8 years old. And really, when I saw that, my world kind of really fell apart, because here was, I'd spent so much time with this person. I thought I knew him really well. And actually, he didn't exist. I didn't even know his name. And if you try and think about what that does to you, basically, I then started looking at everybody else around me, thinking, well, how do I know that any of you are real? And it really messes with your head. As Alison has described, you kind of descend into what some people call paranoia, but then people also said that we were being paranoid, thinking that we had undercover police officers in our life. So it's like, where does the paranoia start and end, and where does reality start and end? It basically left me not really knowing who to trust and being very unsure of my own judgment, because if I could be so wrong about somebody who I knew so well, how could I be sure I'd be right about anything else? I continued in my search, and eventually I found the marriage certificate. I found out the real name of my former partner, John Dines, and I found his marriage certificate, which said that he'd been a police officer at the time he got married in the late 1970s. And at that point, I kind of thought, right, that's it. I now know the truth, that he was a police officer. But there hadn't been many people I had talked to about this, because obviously, if the potential was that he'd been an undercover policeman, I obviously didn't want to talk to anybody else, just in case they were also undercover police, and if they knew that I was searching for him and trying to find out the truth, they'd put barriers in my way and try and stop me finding out. So there were a very limited number of people that I talked to about this. But when I talk to people about, well, look, I found this marriage certificate, can you believe it? He must have been an undercover policeman. People actually said to me, including my dad, no, you're being paranoid, that wouldn't happen in this country. There must be another explanation. You know, it must be that, oh, actually, he'd been a policeman and he'd decided much later on that he wanted to become a political activist, but he was embarrassed about his police background, and so he'd, you know, made up this identity. People really didn't want to believe that that could happen in this country, that you could have undercover policemen having relationships with women for years on end. And that in itself did more, you know, mess with my head even more, because it's sort of like, oh well, these people who I kind of trust around me are sort of saying, you know, listen to yourself, you seem to be becoming a bit paranoid. All the while that my search was going on, actually the police were taking steps to prevent me finding out the truth. What I now know is that when I got close to finding him, when I went to New Zealand, they actually moved him to another country. They relocated him to prevent me finding him. And the only reason that I found out the truth is because one of the other women in our case that Harriet and Alison have talked about, one of the other women had ended up finding the guy that she'd had a relationship with, and ended up having children with him and married to him. And during the course of that marriage, he actually told her that my ex-partner had been an undercover policeman. So the only reason that the truth came out was not through the police. It was through the detective work of women in these abusive relationships. About the same time that she contacted me to tell me this was around the same time that the Mark Kennedy case was being exposed in the media, and as you've heard, he was being portrayed as a rogue officer, gone off the rails, done his own thing. It's not the fault of the police, and obviously we knew different, and we got together to bring this case. There were, as you've heard, 8 of us in this case. We had relationships between us with 5 different undercover officers, and those relationships spanned a period of nearly 25 years. So that absolutely shows that this was not the actions of individual officers. This is an institutional practice. It's institutional sexism. And, you know, recent years have seen the massive scandal of celebrity phone hacking, which is widely recognised to be a complete invasion of privacy. And as one of my co-claimants has said in our case, the relationships that we were in were like body hacking. They basically, these men used and the police used our bodies and our minds. They had access to our innermost thoughts because we thought that they were real people and that we were engaged in loving relationships. So, you know, we shared our innermost thoughts with them. We've got absolutely no idea how much of that is now on special branch files. The psychological damage, you know, arising from this emotional manipulation and having been used gratuitously in this way is huge. And, you know, those of us that were in relationships and when our partners disappeared, you know, the fear and worry about someone you love disappearing also causes a huge emotional toll. And, you know, when someone disappears like that, the only person that really can make sense of that disappearance, because you seem like you're in a loving relationship and then this person's disappearing, and none of it makes any sense. The only person that can make sense of that for you is actually the person who's been abusing you, and it leaves women totally vulnerable to then those men coming back into their life and you know, abusing them further, which is actually what happened with the woman who ended up having children and getting married. He, you know, was basically able to completely manipulate her emotions and continue the abuse. She actually had to escape to a women's refuge to get away from him. So it's absolutely shocking that these kind of actions could be even considered as appropriate by the police, the state, who are supposed to, who proclaim that they're here to protect our interests. It's absolutely shocking that they could think it was appropriate to treat women in this way. I think, you really have to ask how it was that they came to think it was okay to use women to shore up these fake identities of these undercover police officers. And basically, for a very long time there had been a canteen culture of predominantly male police officers in the Metropolitan Police. In this particular unit, there were no women at all until the Greenham Common protest started in the early 1980s, and at that point, I should just say that the unit started in 1968, around about the time of the Vietnam War protests. So for the first sort of 10, 15 years, there were no women in this unit. Not that that would make it all right, but it just demonstrates, their attitude towards women, the way that people are treated. Sorry, I'm losing my thread a little bit. I also wanted to talk about the institutional sexism that we've seen within the legal system. It's not just the police. Early on in this process, we were trying to expose what had happened, and we went to the Home Affairs Select Committee. And when we went to them, they asked us what we'd done to end up in these relationships. What must you have been involved in to have these police officers enticing you into relationships? We were basically being expected to prove our innocence. It's a bit like the attitude that says that if you're a woman walking along at night in a short skirt, you deserve to get raped. And in this instance, it's institutional sexism. At this Home Affairs Select Committee, the senior police officer that gave evidence after us was repeatedly asked if she was going to apologise to the families of the children who had died, whose identities had been used by undercover police officers. Not once was she asked if she was going to apologise to the women who had been deceived into intimate long-term relationships. There was basically an assumption that as women we must be guilty, we must have brought this upon ourselves. And yet, many of these MPs that were on that select committee are former lawyers. They should know that there is no law in this country that says that if the police suspect someone of a crime, let alone if they suspect them of political activism, that they are then entitled to sleep with them in order to find out if they were up to something. And it's not surprising that that's not the law, because it's obvious it would be absolutely wide open to abuse for any male officer to say, oh yeah, well I suspected them, so I had to sleep with them. We faced the institutional sexism of the decision from the Crown Prosecution Service, which Harriet's talked about, where basically, so I'll just say briefly, they declined to prosecute the officers for sexual assault or misconduct in public office because they said the relationships were based on genuine feelings of mutual attraction, which is absolutely completely inappropriate and insulting response. The consent was obviously negated by the huge level of deception. There is no way on this earth that anybody would consent to have a relationship with somebody if they knew that everything about that person was false and that that person was in their life to spy on them. And basically what we've seen is a legal system that doesn't value women's lives, as Harriet said, you can't claim for the loss of time, you can only claim for the loss of wages. So that's another thing where obviously women are often responsible for looking after children, that counts for nothing, or they want to have They feel the relationships are important, that they want to spend time ensuring those relationships are successful. That all counts for nothing. The only thing that matters is what your wage is, what you're bringing in. They counted our lives basically as having no financial value, and as the others have mentioned, there's only a finite time for women to have children if they want to have them. So the loss of the ability of the opportunity to have children counts for nothing in the eyes of the legal system. Anyway, enough of the sexism of the legal system, even though you could really go on for quite a lot longer about that. As the others have said, we had the recent victory in November where, despite everything, the police were forced to acknowledge that these relationships were abusive, and that they were a breach of our human rights, and that they caused significant trauma. But as the others have said, we still have no answers to why this abusive behaviour was allowed to happen. We've had absolutely no disclosure. So that's where the public inquiry comes in. We want to make sure that the cover names are released, because without the release of the cover names, any other women or anyone else who was affected by this undercover policing is not able to come forward to give evidence about what happened to them, what the other undercover officers did. And so there's no way for people to, or there's no way for the wider public or the inquiry to see just the extent of this abuse. It's no good just looking at a tiny bit and saying, oh, well, you know, we know about that. The reality is, you know, there were, this was going on for over 40 years with the SDS alone, and then it's continued with the National Public Order Intelligence Unit and the National Domestic Extremism Unit. And, you know, for all we know, it's ongoing. It's highly likely to be ongoing, although, you know, increasingly they are shifting to spying on us through social media. So the reality is we have to have the cover names released so that the true extent of these abuses can be seen. Because ultimately what we want to do is to make sure that these abuses never happen to anybody else again. The police have actually said that it's no longer, these relationships are no longer allowed, but they don't actually put any instructions in writing explicitly saying no, undercover police officers are not allowed relationships, and the legal framework is still the same as it was when Mark Kennedy was abusing the women that he had relationships with. In terms of the public inquiry, which is getting underway, we're having the preliminary hearings. The other key issues to emerge, and which also require the the full disclosure, the truth to come out, are the spying on the grieving families of victims of racist murders or police malpractice, simply for challenging what the police were doing and their inadequate investigations or their violence. Families have been spied on. The links with the blacklisting of trade unionists, where information from the police has been found in the offices of a private company, the Consulting Association, in their files about trade unionists and health and safety reps that were made available to construction companies in order for them to decide that they don't want to hire these people. They were prevented from getting work. There was information that could only have come from the police, information about demonstrations and actually, in my case, I'm on the environmental blacklist, and I know that through the McLibel case in the 1980s, it was shown through that case that there had been an exchange of information between the police and McDonald's and a private investigation firm, two private investigation firms, in fact, that they were using to send private investigators into London Greenpeace. So there's a complete sharing of, well, there's an extensive sharing of information between the police and private corporations, which, when we sued the police, In 2000, they actually said that they would remind all police officers that they weren't to share private information on the police national computer with private companies, and they've still been doing it through the blacklisting, through the blacklisting files through the Consulting Association. On top of that, in the inquiry, a very important issue is all the miscarriages of justice. So far, there are around 150 wrongful convictions that have been exposed just in relation to Mark Kennedy, and he's just one officer. And we now have, nearly 50 years of these units. How many more miscarriages of justice are there that are currently hidden from public view, and people suffering the consequences of unjust convictions that have, may affect your life in quite a serious way? Where undercover police officers have either given evidence using their false names in court or have taken part in privileged legal discussions, and then the potential for them feeding that straight back to the legal team on the opposite side. All of this needs to come out in the public inquiry. Basically the inquiry is a very rare opportunity to seek to ensure that all of these dirty practices which are used to undermine movements for social progress are brought out into the open, that the public becomes aware of them, and that they're stopped. If you'd said 5 years ago about all of these events, no one would have believed it. Since 2011, a huge amount of public of information has come out into the public domain, but we need to ensure that the full picture comes out. In our case, the police claimed that they could neither confirm nor deny anything in relation to the officers. They basically said that this was permanent and across the board, and yet, if you look into it, they've made several statements where they have confirmed or denied things about undercover operations, including a 3-part television series that was basically a puff piece in around about 2002. I was trying to calculate how many years it was, but which gave extensive detail about the movements that they were infiltrating. There were interviews with officers. They talked about the tactics they used. So, the fact that they're now claiming they can't talk about any of those things, it's absolutely clear it's because they want to cover up these abuses. They don't want the full truth to come out. So we all have to make sure that the public inquiry does get to the truth, that the wider public becomes aware of these abuses. These units are a significant part of the process that prevents change from happening, and that ensures that the people that have got huge wealth and who currently hold power are propped up, despite this being against the interests of the rest of us in society, the vast majority of the population. Sorry, I've got I just wanted to mention one other important thing that I really only sort of came to mind when about 2 months ago never mind what, I basically discovered that my former partner was about to be involved in delivering training to Indian police officers in Australia, and that training included training in left-wing extremism. And I became extremely concerned that these now discredited practices that the Metropolitan Police have acknowledged are human rights abuses should not be perpetuated by other police forces around the world. So I went over to Australia to expose his past and confronted him. But I think that's actually a really important issue, because many of these undercover officers have gone on to have careers either in other police forces or educational institutions, or private sector where actually they may be in a position where they're encouraging similar kind of abuses to happen to other people. So I think that's an issue that needs to be kind of taken up and made sure doesn't happen elsewhere. And then finally, because I'm being asked to hurry up, I just wanted to say that the most important thing for us to fight about is to continue to not be deterred by these undercover officers. You know, the reality is that they're in our movements trying to undermine them because they know that when we do talk to other people about the kind of change that we want to see in the world and the fact that we don't have to put up with injustice and oppression, we could create a society that is based around meeting everybody's needs and respect for each other and respect for the environment. Don't be deterred, keep on at it. It is, you know, we need to create a better society with a sustainable future and yeah, keep on at it, sorry.